Dublin goes dark, and in that darkness someone starts hunting with the city's fear as cover. By morning, the only witnesses are shaken neighbors and a silence that feels staged. By the end, you'll understand how a blackout, a public park, and a campaign of gaslighting can fuse into the perfect hunting ground, and why the official story never fully closes the loop. Because when a killer learns they can rewrite what people think they saw, the next victim isn't chosen by chance, it's chosen by control. Was the Phoenix Park murder spree the work of one predator exploiting the blackout, or a smaller truth being buried under a larger lie? The city goes dark all at once. Not a gradual dim, a clean cut. Street lights snap off. Windows become black squares, and for a few seconds, Dublin is only breath and footsteps. In Phoenix Park, a man runs. He is not running for exercise. He is running because behind him, somewhere in the trees, something just happened that cannot be undone. A woman's scream tears through the dark. Then another voice closer. A man shouting a name. Then the heavy sound of someone falling. When the lights come back, it is not relief that arrives, it is clarity. On the grass near the main path, a body lies in a posture that makes no sense. Shoes twisted, coat pulled wrong, hands angled like they tried to hold the night back. A patrol car rolls in slow, headlights washing the scene. A guarder steps out and freezes. He does not kneel first. He looks around as if expecting the darkness to return and finish the job. They will call it a murder. But people who were there will say it felt like a performance, like someone used the blackout as a stage cue, and in the first hour, before the papers have a name, before the rumors can pick a monster, the most frightening detail is this: no one can agree on what they saw. So here is the question that forms in the park before dawn. Was the blackout only a cover? Or was it part of the plan? Phoenix Park is too large to feel owned. It belongs to everyone and, because of that, to no one. In daylight, it is open and forgiving. Paths, gates, dog walkers, cyclists. A normal place where bad things are not supposed to happen, but at night, the park becomes a map of choices. Every turn is a decision. Every hedge is a hiding place. On the day it happens, the weather is ordinary. That matters later, because ordinary weather makes an extraordinary crime feel even more wrong. The victim is identified quickly. Someone with a life that had plans. A person who, hours earlier, was not thinking about endings. And yet the first accounts are already splitting. One witness says there were two men, another says it was one man, tall, wearing a dark coat. A third swears the attacker's voice was familiar, like someone from the neighborhood. There is also the detail that haunts the first responder. The victim's eyes are open. That detail does not prove anything, but it changes the temperature of the story. The scene is contained. Tape goes up. Radios crackle. Flashlights sweep over leaves and litter. And then, in the background, as if it is nothing, someone says it, the power went out across the city, not just here, the whole city. Which means this was not an isolated darkness, it was a shared one. And shared darkness makes people suggest patterns. It makes them look for a hand behind the curtain. So the first night ends with a new kind of fear. Not fear of the park, fear of the grid, fear of a switch somewhere. And the question hardens. If the blackout wasn't local, who would count on it happening right when they needed it? By morning, Dublin is bright again. Shops open. Traffic complains. People carry coffee and pretend the night was only an inconvenience. But the park is different. It has become a place you picture, even when you are not there. Investigators start with what they can touch: footprints pressed into damp soil, fibers snagged on thorn, a smear that could be mud or something else. They walk the paths in reverse. They try to turn panic into geometry, and every time they do, the blackout comes back into the room. Because the timeline is the weapon. During those minutes without power, the killer can move without being seen. Or the killer can stand still and let confusion do the work. Witnesses want to be helpful, but help is messy. One person insists they saw a figure near the monument. Another swears they heard laughter. Someone else says it was silent, completely silent, until the scream. The human mind does that in darkness. It fills the gaps. It makes sound from shadows. And into those gaps, fear pours. The press arrives, hungry and careful at the same time. They do not want to be wrong, but they cannot afford to be late. Headlines suggest a predator. Radio callers suggest a gang. A pub conversation suggests a lover. And then, as if pulled from an older story, a name begins to form. The Ripper. Not because of facts. Because of appetite. Because of appetite. Because a city knows that a monster makes chaos feel organized, but calling someone a Ripper is also a way of saying the crime is not personal. It is a way of saying it could happen to anyone. So the question at the end of the first day becomes something else. Is the city looking for the truth? Or is it looking for a story it already understands? If this was a blackout killer, why do the first reports describe lights that shouldn't have been on? Who had power when the rest of the city didn't? Forget the killer for a second. Who decided what the public was allowed to know? And why did that decision happen before the bodies were even identified? A panic does not start with running. It starts with listening. People listen to the wrong things at the right time. A neighbor says they saw a stranger near a bus stop. That becomes a sighting. A taxi driver says someone climbed in shaking. That becomes an escape. A nurse says the victim's injuries were precise. That becomes expertise. The Gardai try to slow it down. They ask for calm. They ask for calm. They ask for facts. But calm is not contagious. The blackout gives the story a supernatural edge. People talk about fate. They talk about timing. They talk about someone who can make the lights go out. And then the gaslighting begins. Not in the Hollywood sense of a husband dimming lamps. In the real sense, the small, cruel pressure that makes people question what they saw and what they know. Someone says, "You were drinking." Someone says, "It was too dark for you to tell." Someone says, "You're mixing it up with another night." Witnesses start to shrink their own memories. They apologize for them. They second-guess the color of a coat. They retract the height of a man. They lose the certainty they had in the first telling, and if a witness can be made to doubt themselves, then the killer has already won one battle. The investigation begins to split into two tracks, the track of evidence and the track of narrative. The track of narrative is faster. It is louder. It is also easier to manipulate, so the question for the detectives becomes urgent. Are they chasing a murderer, or are they chasing the shape of a rumor? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. One witness says they heard a woman's scream, then immediately heard laughter. So whose voice was that, and why did it sound practiced? What if the panic was part of the method? The blackout itself becomes a suspect. Engineers are consulted. Reports are requested. Timings are compared. Was it a failure? A fault? A cascade? Or did someone do something? The problem is simple and maddening. A city grid is complicated enough to fail on its own, and also complicated enough to hide sabotage. So investigators try to anchor the case to what is local. What happened in the park? Who was near the park? Who had a reason to be there? The victim's last hours are reconstructed like a fragile vase. A conversation. A message. A plan to meet. Every detail becomes heavy. If the victim went to the park willingly, then the killer might be someone trusted. If the victim was followed, then the killer might be a stranger. But strangers are harder to imagine. People want faces, so they begin to supply them. They point at the man who keeps to himself. They point at the youth who wears black. They point at the foreigner with the wrong accent. And the more the city points, the more the real killer can disappear inside the noise. The Gardari release a description, careful and thin. Male. Dark clothing. Seen near the path, it is barely a description at all. It could be half the men in the city, but it does something. It teaches the public to look at each other sideways. And as people look, they start to see what they are afraid of. So here is the question that rises as the second week begins. If everyone fits the description, how do you stop hunting the wrong person? The timeline everyone repeats only works if you trust the first phone call. But that call's details keep changing. Who benefits when the clock itself becomes unreliable? Now listen closely. The most important witness might be a street lamp that never should have lit up, so who kept it powered? A case like this forces choices. Do you focus on the victim's circle, where motives live, and risk missing a predator? Or do you focus on strangers, where patterns live, and risk missing something personal? Detectives go door to door. They ask about arguments. They ask about exes. They ask about debts. They also ask about the blackout. Where were you when the lights went out? Who were you with? What did you hear? Most people answer honestly. Some people answer too quickly, and some people answer as if they rehearsed. There is always one thing in a murder investigation that feels like a hinge, a small detail that swings everything. In this case, it is time, not the hour on the clock. The minutes inside the darkness. How long was the city out? How long was the park out? Did the power return in one wave or in patches? If patches, then the killer could have moved from dark to light like stepping stones. If one wave, then the killer needed luck. Or certainty, and certainty implies knowledge. It implies someone who knew the blackout was coming, or someone who caused it. The detectives don't say that out loud, not yet. But the city says it for them, and once a city starts believing in a mastermind, it becomes harder to accept a simpler answer. So the question hangs in the air. Is the idea of control coming from evidence, or from fear? Police focused on the stranger in the park, but the most consistent detail is a familiar silhouette. What if the killer didn't need to hide because they belonged there? A nickname is a weapon. Once people begin calling him the Blackout Ripper, the case changes. A nickname makes a killer feel like a character. And characters invite imitation. They invite false confessions. They invite prank calls. They invite people who want to borrow the attention. The Gardari receive tips that are dramatic and useless. A voice on a phone says the killer is a doctor. Another says he is a soldier. Another says it is a woman. One caller whispers a name, then hangs up. The detectives follow what they can. They cross-check what is possible. But every hour spent running down a fantasy is an hour the real trail cools. In the streets, the panic becomes ritual. People check their locks twice. They avoid the park. They walk in pairs. They glance up at streetlights as if they might betray them. And in homes, another kind of damage appears. Couples argue about safety. Parents argue about curfews. Friends accuse friends of being reckless. Fear turns ordinary life into an interrogation. That is how a killer can spread without moving. That is how a single murder can become a citywide sickness. And then there is the most dangerous thing. Someone claims the victim had been warned, that a message was sent, that the victim ignored it. It is unverified. It is also irresistible. Because it implies the killer spoke. If the killer spoke once, he might speak again. So the question at the end of this chapter is simple. Is the killer reaching into the investigation, or is the city inventing a voice for him? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. A victim's last known movement is treated like fact, yet the source is a single person who later retracts it. What would make someone lie early, then tell the truth later, or the other way around? Gaslighting is not only personal, it can be communal. It can happen when a crowd decides what must have happened and then punishes anyone who says otherwise. A witness says the attacker limped. Days later, that witness says, no, maybe he didn't. A witness says there was a second person. Later they say, I must have been mistaken. Some of that is normal memory decay. But some of it is pressure. Pressure from friends who want the story to be tidy. Pressure from journalists who want a quote that matches a headline. Pressure from officers who want a timeline that holds. In a high-profile case, certainty becomes currency. And witnesses learn that uncertainty is treated like failure, so they choose certainty, even if it is borrowed, even if it is wrong. This is where investigations can break. Not because detectives are careless, because humans are. Because humans are. Because humans want the pain to make sense, and when the pain does not make sense, they build a shape around it. Inside the Garda station, the case files swell. Statements, restatements, restatements, corrections. A forest of paper, trying to describe a forest of trees, and the killer, whoever he is somewhere in the gaps. So the question becomes more uncomfortable. If witness memory is being reshaped in real time, what part of the story is still real? There's a rumor of a second attacker, but the wounds suggest one set of hands moving with confidence. If it was one person, how did they create the illusion of a group? Let's rewind the night by 10 minutes, because one missing 10-minute window is where the whole case either collapses or makes terrifying sense. Every investigation has a moment when the focus tightens. A person of interest, a vehicle, a pattern. In this case, the tightening begins with a routine check that turns strange. Someone reports a man seen in the park after hours on another night, not the night of the murder. Another night. He is described as calm. Too calm. He is not running. He is not hiding. He is standing near a path as if waiting for something. When approached, he gives a reason for being there that does not sit right. It is the kind of reason that could be true, and also the kind of reason that could be rehearsed. Detectives dig. They look at where he lives, where he works, where he works, where he was during the blackout. They look for scratches, for bruises, for stains that should not be there. But suspicion is not proof, and proof is what courtrooms demand. The city hears about the man anyway. Of course it does. Leaks happen. Rumors happen. Soon he is not a man. He is the man. Strangers follow him, neighbors whisper. Someone throws something at his door. He insists he did nothing. And the detectives, trapped between public pressure and legal reality, are forced to decide how hard to push. Because pushing too hard can ruin a case, and pushing too softly can let a killer breathe. So here is the question. Is this the first real lead or the first scapegoat? The case file treats the blackout like background noise, but the offender uses it like a tool. Who knew exactly which paths would go blind first? A killer who uses darkness is not only hiding from others, he may be hiding from himself. That is one theory detectives consider. That the blackout provided anonymity, not just from witnesses, but from conscience. When the lights are out, you can pretend you are someone else. You can pretend you are not doing what you are doing. And if the city is already confused, you can let confusion protect you. This is where the phrase gaslight panic begins to make sense. Panic scrambles people. Gaslighting keeps them scrambled. Together, they make the truth slippery. Detectives return to the victim's last known movements. They revisit stops, shops, bus routes. They ask who saw the victim smiling, who saw the victim worried, who saw the victim with someone. And they find the hardest kind of fact. The victim may have been meeting someone voluntarily. That does not mean they knew what would happen. It only means the door might have been opened from the inside. The idea lands badly in the public mind, because it suggests the killer did not need to chase. He only needed to be invited. So the question presses on. If the victim trusted the wrong person, who was close enough to be trusted, but cold enough to kill. Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. A neighbor swears they saw someone guiding a victim, not chasing them. Why would a victim follow unless they thought they were being helped? Here's the uncomfortable twist. The gaslighting didn't start after the murders. It started before anyone realized there was a murderer. There is a point when the investigation becomes not only about solving a crime, but about controlling a city. The Garda increase patrols. They place officers near the park. They coordinate with utility officials. They want to prevent another blackout from becoming another opportunity. But prevention has a shadow. It changes how people move. It changes how people see each other. A city under watch begins to feel like a city under suspicion, and the killer, if he is watching, learns something from that. He learns where the lights are. He learns where the patrols are. He learns where the patrols are. He learns how fear redirects the crowd. Meanwhile, the press cycle keeps turning. Some outlets start questioning the Gardaí. How could this happen in the park? Why were there no cameras? Why no immediate arrest? Other outlets question witnesses. Why didn't someone intervene? Why didn't someone see more? The questions are unfair. They are also predictable. Panic always wants someone to blame. If it cannot find the killer, it will choose a substitute. And then, quietly, another detail emerges. A report of a similar approach in the park weeks earlier. A person followed. A voice behind them, the feeling of being guided toward a darker path. No assault that time. Just the impression. Just the threat. If that earlier incident is connected, then the killer practiced. And if he practiced, then he planned. So the question is unavoidable. Was the murder an impulse in the dark? Or the final step of a rehearsal? The press called him the Blackout Ripper. But the most chilling part isn't the cutting, it's the conversation. What did he say that made people doubt their own memory? Investigators begin to think in terms of behavior. Not just what the killer did, but what he wanted people to feel. A blackout does not only hide an attack, it creates a memory. It makes everyone who lived through it remember where they were. It makes them remember the sound of the city without electricity. If the killer wanted attention, the blackout gave it. If the killer wanted confusion, it delivered that too. But there is an alternative. What if the blackout is coincidence? What if the city's biggest fear is simply the story it told itself to connect two unrelated events? That possibility is almost intolerable. Because coincidence is hard to fight. You cannot arrest coincidence. You cannot interrogate it. You cannot put it on trial. So the detectives chase what can be chased. They examine the injury patterns. They consult experts. They attempt to place the weapon, even if the weapon itself is missing. They look for a signature. But signatures are tricky. People see patterns because they want patterns. And yet, killers do sometimes repeat themselves. So the question becomes a knife edge. Are the investigators seeing a signature, or are they carving one into the facts? A key description appears in early statements, then disappears from later ones as if edited out. Who changed the story, and how high did that change travel? Stop picturing a chase, because the evidence reads more like an appointment. And that raises one question nobody wants to ask. In the weeks that follow, the story starts to drift. Not because the murder is forgotten, because people cannot live at full fear forever. They return to routines. They laugh again, and then feel guilty for laughing. They walk near the park again, and then speed up without realizing. The case remains open. It remains loud in the minds of detectives. But in the public, it becomes something else. A warning, a bedtime story, a reason not to take the shortcut, and the killer, if he is still there, benefits from that drift. Because drift is the enemy of urgency. Then, a development lands. An item is found. Something small. Something easy to overlook. It is discovered not by a detective, but by an ordinary person in daylight. That detail matters, because it reminds the city that the park holds things long after the night has passed. The item could be nothing. It could be a coincidence, or it could be the thread. A thread that, if pulled, unravels a coat. A story. A person. Detectives treat it carefully, too carefully to share. The silence creates its own rumors. And now the question flips. If the Gardari have something, why does it still feel like they have nothing? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. When a community feels kept in the dark, it starts making its own light. Armchair investigators appear. They draw maps. They argue about timings. They decide which witness is lying, and the internet, or the older version of it through phone-ins and letters to editors, does what it always does. It turns suspicion into entertainment. A man who resembles a sketch is harassed. A family is whispered about. A local eccentric becomes a headline. The cruelty is casual, because fear gives people permission. Detectives, meanwhile, try to keep the case clean. They know a single contaminated tip can waste weeks. They know a forced confession can collapse in court. They know public pressure can push them into mistakes. And in the middle of all this, the victim's family lives in a private version of the story. They do not get to treat it as a mystery. They get to treat it as a hole in the calendar. Every holiday has the missing chair. Every anniversary has the sharp edge. They want justice. They also want dignity. And dignity is hard to preserve when a city is hungry. So the question becomes moral. Who is the investigation serving now? The truth, or the public's need to feel safe again? Investigators marked one route through Phoenix Park as impossible in the dark, yet that's the route the killer seems to take. What if it wasn't dark to him at all? There is another creature in this story, not the killer, the blackout. It returns in conversation whenever new information appears. It returns like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. Some people claim there were flickers before the full outage. Others claim the outage was sudden and total. A few insist certain streets stayed lit. If that last claim is true, then the killer might have chosen a route through the park that stayed darkest longest. That implies knowledge. Maybe insider knowledge, or maybe the simple knowledge of someone who has walked those paths for years. Detectives look at workers with access to infrastructure. They look at anyone who might have been in a position to predict an outage. But access is not the same as intent, and in a city, thousands have access to something. Keys, panels, schedules. Again, the case refuses to narrow, so investigators try another angle. What about behavior after the event? Who changed routines? Who suddenly avoided the park? Who started talking too much? Who started talking not at all? But behavior is also slippery. An innocent person can panic. A guilty person can appear calm. And the city keeps telling itself the same thing. The killer used the blackout. Even when there is no proof of that, it feels true. So here is the question. If everyone believes the blackout was part of the crime, what happens if the truth is less dramatic? One suspect had a perfect alibi, until you look at who provided it and when. If the alibi is a performance, who was the audience meant to be? If you think this is a story about darkness, you're missing the point. This is a story about permission and who had it that night. In a case defined by darkness, light becomes symbolic. Streetlights are repaired faster. New bulbs are installed. Some paths are trimmed back. The park is made to look safer. But safety is not only about visibility. It is about trust, and trust has been damaged. People now assume a stranger might not be a stranger. They assume a friendly offer could be a trap. They assume that if the power goes out again, something bad will follow. That is the psychological aftershock. The murder becomes attached to the very idea of uncertainty. Then, somewhere in the investigation, someone makes a mistake. A detail is shared that should not be shared. Or a suspect is questioned in a way that lets them learn what police know. It does not need to be dramatic. Small leaks can have large consequences. If the killer is paying attention, he learns where the net is. And if he learns where the net is, he learns where it isn't. So the city tightens again. Not with new fear, with old fear resurfacing. Because people sense it, the investigation is not in control. It is reacting. And that leads to one more question. Is the killer still shaping the story from the shadows? Or is the system doing it to itself? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. The panic in the city wasn't just fear, it was misdirection, and it worked. What clue did everyone walk past because they were told to look somewhere else? Cases like this often end in one of two ways: a clean resolution, or a long haunting. The Blackout Ripper story begins to lean toward haunting. Not because detectives stop working, because time itself becomes the adversary. Memories dull. People move, witnesses die, records disappear into archives. And yet the park remains. The path remains. The spot becomes a place people avoid without admitting they know why. Years later, someone will still say, "You know what happened there," and someone else will answer, "Yes, during the blackout." As if the blackout is the date. As if the city's darkness is the culprit. The victim becomes more than a person in the public memory. They become the symbol of that night. That is another kind of loss, a loss of individuality, because symbols are easy to carry. Individuals are harder. Detectives retire. New detectives inherit the file. They read the old statements and hear the old uncertainties, and they face the same problem. The story is loud, the proof is quiet. So here is the question that lingers. If the case is never solved, what exactly is left behind, a killer, or a legend. There is a phenomenon in unsolved cases: the Phoenix effect. The story dies down, then rises again. A new tip, a new technology, a new witness who finally speaks, a new detective who sees an old detail differently. Phoenix Park, by name alone, invites that metaphor. A place named for rebirth. A case that refuses to stay buried. And each time the story rises, it brings the same danger. A new wave of suspicion. A new wave of gaslighting. People telling others, "You didn't see that. You couldn't have. You're remembering it wrong." The same pressure, just in different hands. If there is ever a resolution, it will likely come from something that does not blink. A record, a sample, a match, something that does not care about panic or rumor. But even then, the city will ask for meaning, not just names. Why this victim? Why this pace? Why this night? Why this place? Why this night? Why the blackout? And that final question may never have an answer that satisfies, because sometimes the truth is not a story. Sometimes it is only a fact. So we end where we began. A city in darkness. A scream. A body on the grass. And a name that might be real, or might be the city's attempt to make fear tangible. The last question is the hardest one. If the lights had stayed on, would the killer still have killed?